It was a Monday morning in Manhattan, and the line at Starbucks stretched nearly to the door. The autumn sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Near the register, a woman in a tailored charcoal suit reached for her company card, her expression composed, her posture impeccable. Everything about her suggested control, precision, the kind of person who scheduled her coffee runs between meetings and never ran late. The barista swiped the card once, then again. The machine beeped twice in quick succession, declined. A flicker of something crossed her face, quickly suppressed, embarrassment masked by years of professional composure. Behind her, a man in a dark security uniform stepped forward without hesitation, handing over a few crumpled bills he had pulled from his jacket pocket. Their eyes met briefly, a polite nod exchanged, nothing more. Neither knew that just 3 days earlier, their paths had already crossed in a way that would soon change everything. Marcus Cole had not always worn a uniform with his name stitched above the pocket. There was a time when his badge was a keycard to the executive floors of one of Seattle's most prominent tech firms, when his mornings began with engineering stand-ups and his evenings ended with code reviews that stretched past midnight. He had been good at what he did. More than good. At 32, he had led a team of 12 software engineers, designed systems that processed millions of transactions daily, and earned the kind of salary that let his family live comfortably in a 4-bedroom house in Bellevue with a swing set in the backyard and a garden where his wife grew tomatoes every summer. His wife, Sarah, had been a pediatric nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital. She had a way of making everyone feel seen, whether it was a frightened child in the emergency room or a stranger in the grocery store who looked like they were having a hard day. She would notice things other people missed. A trembling lip, a hesitation in someone's step, and she would find small ways to help without making anyone feel pitied. Their daughter, Emma, had inherited her mother's warmth and her father's curiosity about how things worked. At 5 years old, she could spend an hour watching ants carry crumbs across the sidewalk, asking questions. Marcus did not always know how to answer but loved trying to figure out together. Their son, Ethan, was 3 years younger. A quiet boy who preferred puzzles to playgrounds and always wanted to sit in his father's lap during thunderstorms, his small hands clutching Marcus's shirt until the rumbling passed. The accident happened on a rainy October evening, the kind of night when the streetlights blurred into orange halos and every driver should have been more careful. Sarah was driving home from her shift with Emma in the back seat, the two of them singing along to a Disney song on the radio, their voices slightly off-key but full of joy. A delivery truck ran a red light at an intersection 3 blocks from their house. The driver had been checking his phone. The impact was instantaneous, a collision of metal and glass and shattered possibilities. Sarah died at the scene. Emma was gone before the paramedics could reach her. Ethan, who had been home with Marcus that night because he had a mild fever, would never remember his mother's voice clearly again, would spend years straining to recall the exact sound of her laughter. In the months that followed, Marcus tried to hold the pieces of his life together. He took bereavement leave, then extended it when going back to work felt impossible. He sat in therapy sessions where he could not find words to describe the emptiness that had settled into his chest. He watched Ethan withdraw into silence, flinching at sudden sounds, refusing to sleep alone, asking questions about death that no parent should have to answer. The boy had nightmares about rain, about cars, about losing his father too. Marcus learned to recognize the signs of a panic attack, to hold his son through the trembling, to sit beside him in the dark until the fear finally loosened its grip and sleep came. Returning to work became impossible. The demands of his position required long hours, unpredictable travel, the kind of focus he could no longer summon. His mind wandered in meetings. He missed deadlines he had never missed before. His manager was understanding at first, then concerned, then quietly suggesting that perhaps Marcus needed more time away. But it was not time he needed. It was presence. His son needed him present, not distracted by server outages and deployment deadlines. Ethan needed to know that his father would be there when he woke from a nightmare, would be waiting at school pickup, would not disappear the way his mother and sister had. So, Marcus made a choice that his former colleagues did not understand, that his own parents questioned, that looked from the outside like surrender but felt from the inside like the hardest decision he had ever made. He resigned. He sold the house in Bellevue with its swing set and tomato garden and moved to a small two-bedroom apartment in Queens, closer to his sister, who could help with Ethan when needed. He took a job as a security guard at a commercial office building in Midtown Manhattan, the kind of work that offered health insurance, predictable shifts, and the ability to be home every evening by 6. It was not the life he had planned. But it was a life he could manage, a life that left room for being a father first. He walked Ethan to school each morning, helped with homework each night, and made sure there was always someone there when the boy woke from a bad dream. The work itself was simple, almost meditative. He checked badges, monitored security cameras, greeted the same faces each day as they hurried past. Some of the executives barely noticed him, looking through him as if he were part of the furniture. Others nodded politely. A few remembered his name and asked about his weekend. He did not mind the invisibility. It gave him space to think, to breathe, to heal in the slow way that grief demanded. 3 years passed this way, each day building on the one before, small improvements accumulating into something that resembled stability. Ethan, now 10, was doing better. He had friends at school, played soccer on weekends, and could finally sleep through most nights without waking in fear. He still avoided talking about his mother and sister, but he had started keeping a photo of them on his nightstand, which the therapist said was progress. Marcus began to feel, cautiously, that they had found their footing on solid ground again, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a thought began to form, tentative and fragile as a seedling. Maybe it was time to try again. Maybe he could find a way back into the industry he had left behind, something remote, something flexible, something that would not require him to sacrifice the stability they had worked so hard to build. Technology had changed in 3 years, but the fundamentals remained the same, and his skills, though dormant, had not disappeared. So, he updated his resume for the first time in years, polished his LinkedIn profile, and began applying to positions that seemed like reasonable fits. One company in particular caught his attention, Axis Technologies, a fast-growing firm with offices in the very building where he worked security, known for its innovative approach to data security and its distributed workforce. The role was senior engineer, remote-friendly, with a team spread across 3 time zones. It felt like exactly what he had been looking for, a chance to rebuild without tearing down everything he had constructed. He spent 2 weeks tailoring his application, writing a cover letter that explained his background without dwelling on the tragedy, emphasizing his experience and skills rather than the reasons for his departure. He submitted it on a Sunday night, double-checking every line, and allowed himself, briefly, to hope. The rejection arrived 4 days later. It was a form email, professionally worded but unmistakably final. After careful review, we have decided not to move forward with your application at this time. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. There was no interview, no phone screen, no opportunity to explain the gap in his employment history or demonstrate that his abilities remained sharp. Just a door closing before he had even reached the threshold. Marcus read the email 3 times, searching for something he might have missed, some indication of what had gone wrong. Then he searched for answers online, scrolling through forums and articles about hiring practices in the tech industry. What he found confirmed what he had suspected but hoped was not true. The 3-year gap in his employment history had triggered an automatic flag in the company's applicant tracking system. No human had reviewed his qualifications. No one had read his carefully crafted cover letter or examined the portfolio he had updated specifically for this application. An algorithm had scanned his resume, identified the gap, and generated a recommendation in milliseconds. Not suitable. Risk factor elevated. Application declined. He sat at his kitchen table that night, staring at the email on his laptop screen, feeling something he had not felt in a long time. Not sadness, exactly. Not anger. Something closer to resignation, a familiar weight settling back onto his shoulders. He had known the gap would be a problem. He had just hoped that somewhere, someone would be willing to look past it, to see the context, to understand that stepping away from a career did not mean losing the ability to excel, but the system was not designed for context. It was designed for efficiency, for processing thousands of applications with minimal human intervention. And efficiency had no room for stories like his, no category for grief or sacrifice or the complicated mathematics of being a good father. What Marcus did not know, could not have known, was that the woman whose coffee he had paid for that Monday morning was the CEO of Axis Technologies. Her name was Claire Whitmore, and she had built the company from a two-person startup in her apartment to a workforce of over 500 employees in less than a decade. She was 38 years old, unmarried, and known in the industry for her sharp mind, her exacting standards, and her ability to make decisions faster than most people could process the options. She had been profiled in Forbes, interviewed on CNBC, and invited to speak at conferences where tickets cost more than some people earned in a month. Her success had come at a cost she rarely acknowledged, even to herself. The hours were relentless, beginning before dawn and often ending well past midnight. The pressure was constant, a never-ending stream of decisions that each felt consequential, each demanded her full attention. She had not taken a vacation in 3 years, had not visited her parents in Connecticut in 18 months, and could not remember the last time she had dinner with someone who was not a colleague, investor, or potential client. Her apartment on the Upper West Side was immaculate and empty, decorated by a professional she had met exactly once, filled with furniture she had chosen from a catalog during a layover at O'Hare. She slept 5 hours a night when she was lucky, 4 when she was not. She told herself it was temporary, that she would slow down once the company reached a certain milestone, once the next funding round closed, once the market stabilized. But the milestones kept moving, receding like the horizon, and she kept chasing them because she did not know what else to do, because stopping felt more frightening than exhaustion. The morning of the declined card had been the culmination of a particularly brutal week. A major client had threatened to pull their contract over a security concern that had turned out to be a false alarm but required 48 hours of damage control. Her CFO had delivered projections that necessitated immediate cost-cutting in departments that could not afford to lose more people. She had spent 14 hours in meetings the day before and had forgotten to eat anything more substantial than a protein bar from the vending machine on the 32nd floor. When her corporate card failed at the Starbucks register, it was not because of insufficient funds. It was a fraud alert triggered by an unusual transaction she had made the previous evening, a $2,000 donation to a children's grief counseling charity she had found online at 2 in the morning when sleep refused to come. She had seen an article about children who had lost parents, had thought about them lying awake in the dark the way she sometimes did, and had made the donation impulsively, forgetting to confirm the fraud alert that followed. A small oversight in a week full of larger ones. The security guard's gesture had caught her off guard. She was not accustomed to strangers offering help without expecting something in return. In her world, kindness usually came with conditions, with expectations, with invoices attached. But the man had simply paid for her coffee, a $5 gesture, and stepped back without waiting for thanks, without even seeming to expect acknowledgement. She had nodded, said thank you in a voice that came out more surprised than she intended, and walked out with her latte, already answering emails on her phone before she reached the door. She did not think about him again until 2 days later. It happened during a quarterly review of the company's hiring metrics. Claire was meeting with her head of human resources, a meticulous woman named Patricia, who had been with the company since the early days and who believed in data the way some people believed in intuition. Patricia presented the usual numbers with the usual precision. Applications received, interviews conducted, offers extended, positions filled, time to hire averages. retention rates by department. Then, she pulled up a secondary report, one that tracked candidates who had been automatically filtered out by the applicant tracking system before reaching human review. Claire had seen these reports before. They were a necessary byproduct of scaling, a trade-off she had accepted years ago when the company started receiving more applications than any human team could reasonably process. When a company received 10,000 applications a month, there was no way to review each one individually. The algorithm was a tool, nothing more, a filter designed to identify candidates who met specific criteria and flag those who did not. Employment gaps were one such criterion. Statistically, candidates with gaps longer than 2 years were less likely to succeed in their roles, more likely to leave within the first year, more likely to require additional training and support. The data supported the policy. Claire had approved it herself, had signed off on the thresholds, had never questioned the human cost of automation. But something made her pause that day. Perhaps it was exhaustion breaking down her usual efficiency. Perhaps it was the lingering memory of the security guard's quiet dignity, the way he had helped without hesitation or expectation. She asked Patricia to pull up a random sample of rejected applications from the past month, candidates who had been filtered out for employment gaps alone. Patricia complied, her expression curious but professional, and Claire began scrolling through the list on the conference room screen. Most were unremarkable, resumes that revealed little beyond dates and job titles. A few were clearly unqualified, even beyond the gap issue. And then, she saw a name that made her stop scrolling, her finger hovering over the trackpad. Marcus Cole. The address listed was in Queens. The previous employer was a company she recognized immediately. A tech firm in Seattle known for its rigorous engineering standards and competitive hiring process. His credentials were impressive. A degree from a respected university, 8 years of progressive experience, leadership roles, successful projects. His cover letter was articulate and honest, professional without being boilerplate. And his most recent position, the one that had triggered the gap flag, was security guard at a commercial building in Midtown. The same building where Axis Technologies leased 3 floors. The same building where she had walked past him every day for the past year without ever truly seeing him. Claire sat back in her chair, the connection forming slowly in her mind like a photograph developing in solution. She remembered the uniform, the quiet competence with which he had handled the situation at the coffee shop, the way he had handed the money to the barista as if helping strangers was simply what one did. She had walked past him dozens, perhaps hundreds of times over the past year, had nodded at him occasionally when their paths crossed in the lobby, had never once considered who he might be beyond the badge on his chest. And now she was looking at his resume, at the 3-year gap that her own system had deemed automatically disqualifying, and she realized she had no idea what had caused it. The application provided no explanation. The algorithm had not asked for one. She asked Patricia to pull the full application file. What she found was sparse. No explanation for the gap, no cover letter elaboration beyond the standard professional language. Just a resume that ended abruptly in October 3 years ago and resumed with a position that bore no resemblance to his previous career. The discontinuity was jarring, like a story with a chapter torn out. Claire stared at the screen for a long moment, then did something she rarely did, something that felt like a violation of her own principles about efficiency and boundaries. She opened a browser and began to search. It took less than 10 minutes to find the news article. Seattle Times, October of that year. The headline was straightforward in the way that tragedies often were, stripped of drama because the facts required none. A delivery truck running a red light at the intersection of Pine and 5th. A mother and daughter killed instantly. A husband and son left behind, their names listed with the clinical detachment of newsprint. Sarah Cole, 34, pediatric nurse. Emma Cole, 5, kindergarten student at Eastside Elementary. Survived by husband Marcus and son Ethan, age 2. Claire read the article twice, then a third time. Then she closed the browser and sat in silence for several minutes, aware of Patricia watching her with polite confusion but unable to respond. The numbers on the spreadsheet suddenly felt different, less like data points and more like people, each rejected application potentially carrying a story as heavy as this one. Finally, she spoke, her voice steadier than she felt. "I want to meet with this candidate, personally." Patricia hesitated, her professional composure flickering briefly. "He was filtered out weeks ago. The position has already been filled." Claire nodded slowly, her decision solidifying. "Then find another position. Or create one. But I want to talk to him." The meeting was arranged for the following Tuesday at 3 in the afternoon. Claire's assistant sent the invitation, professional and deliberately vague, requesting Marcus's presence for a discussion about potential opportunities at Axis Technologies. Marcus read the email on his phone during his lunch break, standing in the small break room on the lobby level, certain there had been some mistake. He had already been rejected. He had already accepted that the door was closed, had already begun the process of reconciling himself to the security uniform for another few years. But here was another email, from the CEO's office no less, asking him to come in. He arrived 15 minutes early, wearing the only suit he still owned, a navy blue piece he had bought for his brother's wedding 4 years ago. It still fit, though the shoulders felt slightly tight and the fabric seemed to belong to someone else, a version of himself he barely remembered. The receptionist on the executive floor directed him to a small conference room, and he sat alone for several minutes, watching the city sprawl beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, wondering what this was really about. Claire entered at exactly 3 o'clock, closing the door behind her with a soft click. She was wearing a gray blazer over a white blouse, her hair pulled back in a way that seemed designed to project professionalism rather than approachability. But there was something in her expression that did not match the corporate armor, something that looked almost like uncertainty. "Please sit down," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her own. He sat. She remained standing for another moment, then took her seat, her hands folded in front of her on the table. "I owe you an apology," she began, and Marcus felt his confusion deepen. "For what?" "For rejecting your application without ever reading it. For letting an algorithm make a decision that should have been made by a human being. For walking past you every day for the past year without ever wondering who you were or what your story might be." Marcus was silent. He had prepared for many possible conversations on the elevator ride up, but not this one. He had expected professional courtesy, perhaps a referral to another company, maybe even a token offer designed to assuage corporate guilt. He had not expected honesty this direct, this unguarded. "I looked you up," Claire continued, her voice steady but softer than her public persona. "I know about the accident. About your wife. Your daughter. I know why you left your career, and I know what you have been doing since." She paused, seeming to choose her next words carefully. "I also know that none of that was in your application. You did not explain the gap. You did not ask for sympathy or special consideration." "Why?" Marcus considered the question, turning it over in his mind like a stone whose weight he knew but whose shape still surprised him. "Because it is not relevant," he said finally, his voice even. "My qualifications are what they are. My experience is what it is. What happened to my family is not something I put on a resume. It is not a selling point or a plea for mercy. It is not a reason to hire me, and it should not be a reason not to hire me." He met her eyes directly, holding the gaze without challenge or submission. "I do not want to be a charity case." Claire nodded slowly, something shifting in her expression that he could not quite read. "That is exactly what I was afraid you would say." She leaned forward slightly, her professional distance narrowing. "Let me be clear. I am not offering you a job because I feel sorry for you. I am offering you a job because your credentials are exceptional, because the references I called this morning speak highly of your work, and because my company lost a talented candidate due to a policy I approved without thinking about the people it would affect." She paused, letting the words settle between them. "I am also offering you flexibility, remote work options, adjusted hours when you need them. Whatever you require to continue being the father your son needs. That is not charity. That is recognizing that the best employees are the ones whose lives are not falling apart, the ones who can bring their whole selves to work because their employers give them space to be whole. Marcus sat with her words for a long moment. He thought about Ethan, about the routines they had built together, about the fragile stability that had taken 3 years of careful effort to construct. He thought about the rejection email, about the algorithm that had judged him without knowing him, and he thought about this woman, this CEO who had taken the time to look deeper, to question her own systems, to extend an opportunity she had no obligation to extend. "I need to think about it," he said. She nodded, unsurprised. He accepted the position 2 weeks later, after long conversations with his sister, his therapist, and most importantly with Ethan, who had listened carefully and then asked a single question that cut through all the analysis. "Would it make you happy, Dad?" Marcus had not known how to answer. He had not thought about happiness in those terms for years, but the question lodged somewhere in his chest and would not leave. The transition was not seamless. His first day back in an engineering environment felt foreign, the tools familiar but the context strange, like returning to a childhood home that had been renovated beyond recognition. His new colleagues were polite but curious. The security guard, who had become an engineer. The story spread through the office in whispers, gathering embellishments and speculation as it traveled. Some assumed he had connections, family ties, some hidden advantage that explained the improbable leap from lobby desk to engineering floor. Others assumed something less flattering, that he had charmed the CEO, that there was favoritism at play, that he had not earned his place at the table through merit alone. Marcus heard the whispers but did not respond to them. He had learned, in the years since the accident, that other people's opinions were not something he could control, that defending himself against speculation only fed its growth. He could only control his work, his focus, the quality of what he produced. So he put his head down and did what he had always done. He studied the systems until he understood them, identified the weaknesses others had missed, and began to solve problems no one had asked him to solve. The breakthrough came 6 weeks into his tenure. Axis Technologies had been struggling with a security vulnerability in one of its flagship products, a flaw that had resisted the efforts of 3 different engineering teams over the course of 4 months. The issue was complex, buried deep in legacy code written by developers who had long since left the company, tangled in dependencies that no one fully understood. Clients were growing nervous. The board was asking questions. Claire had begun having nightmares about data breaches and regulatory investigations. Marcus spent 2 weeks tracing the problem, mapping the architecture, documenting connections that had never been properly recorded. He worked late when Ethan was at sleepovers, woke early when the apartment was quiet, brought the puzzle home with him in a way he had not done since Seattle. Then he found it. A single, misconfigured authentication layer, overlooked during a migration 3 years earlier, creating a backdoor that could have exposed thousands of client accounts to anyone who knew where to look. He presented his findings to the security team on a Thursday afternoon, walking them through the vulnerability, the fix, and the testing protocols required to verify the solution. The room was silent when he finished. Not skeptical silence, not the quiet of people waiting to poke holes in his analysis. Something closer to respect, to recognition of work well done. The team lead, a woman named Sandra, who had been with the company since its founding and who had never been known for easy praise, nodded slowly and asked him to implement the patch immediately. The fix went live the following Monday. Within a week, the vulnerability was closed, the clients were notified, and the company had avoided what could have been a catastrophic breach. Marcus did not seek credit for the work. He did not need recognition or praise. But the whispers changed after that. The security guard became the engineer who saved the product. The favoritism narrative faded, replaced by something simpler and more difficult to dismiss. Competence, results, the work speaking for itself. Claire watched the transformation from a distance, careful not to intervene, not to champion Marcus publicly in ways that would fuel the favoritism rumors. She wanted him to succeed on his own terms, and he had. But she also found herself thinking about him more often than she expected, noticing when he arrived in the mornings, wondering how his weekend had been. Not romantically, she told herself, something more complicated than that, something she did not have a framework for understanding. She thought about his steadiness, his refusal to explain himself, his quiet insistence on being judged by his work rather than his story. She thought about the way he had paid for her coffee without expecting anything in return, a small act of kindness from a man who had every reason to be bitter at the world. 3 months after Marcus joined the company, Axis Technologies held its quarterly board meeting. The agenda was routine, financial updates, product roadmaps, hiring projections, but Claire knew there would be questions about the security incident, about how a vulnerability had gone undetected for so long, and about how it had finally been resolved. The questions came from Richard Haynes, a venture capitalist who had led the company's Series B funding and who made no secret of his belief that Claire was too young and too idealistic to run a company of this scale. He had opposed her appointment as CEO 3 years earlier and had been looking for evidence to support his position ever since. "I understand we had a significant security issue," Richard began, his tone careful but pointed, the voice of someone who had practiced appearing reasonable while delivering criticism. "And I understand it was resolved by a recent hire. A former security guard, I am told." He let the words hang in the air like an accusation. "Could you explain to the board how someone with that background came to be working on our most sensitive systems?" Claire felt the tension in the room shift, the other board members watching, waiting to see how she would handle the challenge. She had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed responses, but preparation did not make it easier. Before she could speak, Marcus stood. He had been sitting in the back of the room, present at Claire's request to answer technical questions if needed. Now he walked to the front, his posture relaxed, his expression calm, as if addressing a hostile board of directors was something he did every Thursday. "I can explain," he said, addressing Richard directly, holding the older man's gaze without flinching. "I spent 8 years as a senior engineer at a company you have probably heard of. I designed systems that are still running today, serving millions of users. I left that career because my wife and 5-year-old daughter were killed in a car accident, and my surviving son needed me more than any job did." He paused, letting the words settle into the silence. "I took a position as a security guard because it gave me stable hours and health insurance while I raised my child. It was not a step down. It was a choice about priorities. And when I was ready to return to engineering, I applied to this company because I believed in what it was building. I was rejected by an algorithm that did not know my story and did not care to ask. Claire Whitmore saw past that algorithm. She gave me an opportunity to prove myself, and I did." He turned to face the full board, his voice steady. "The vulnerability I identified had been in your systems for 3 years. It was not found by your existing teams, not because they are incompetent, but because they were too close to the problem, too embedded in assumptions they did not know they were making. I came in with fresh eyes and a different perspective. That is what I bring to this company. Not my past, not my tragedy. My ability to see what others miss." The room was silent. Richard Haynes opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, finding nothing to say that would not make him look petty or cruel. Claire watched Marcus return to his seat, her expression carefully neutral, though something inside her had shifted in a way she would not examine until later. The months that followed brought changes neither of them had anticipated. Their professional relationship evolved slowly, carefully, bounded by the realities of their positions and the watchfulness of people who would interpret any warmth as something it might not be. Claire began inviting Marcus to strategy meetings, valuing his perspective on technical decisions, finding herself curious about his opinions on matters beyond his immediate expertise. Marcus began to see Claire, not just as a CEO, but as a person carrying burdens she rarely acknowledged, working hours that no one could sustain indefinitely, isolated by her position, in ways that mirrored his own isolation after the accident. They had dinner once, then twice, always under the pretense of work discussions, always in public places where colleagues might see them and draw no conclusions beyond professional collaboration. But the conversations wandered, drifting from quarterly projections to childhood memories, from product roadmaps to books they had read, to questions about what they wanted from lives that had not turned out as planned. Ethan met Claire for the first time on a Saturday in April. Marcus had hesitated for weeks about introducing them, protective of the boundary between his work life and his role as a father, uncertain about what Claire's presence might mean or how to explain it. But Ethan had noticed changes in his father, had asked questions about the woman his father sometimes mentioned, the one who had given him a second chance. So Marcus arranged a lunch, casual and low pressure, at a diner near their apartment in Queens that served pancakes shaped like animals. Claire was nervous in a way she had not been since her first board presentation, since the early days when everything depended on her ability to convince skeptical investors that a 28-year-old woman could build something worth believing in. She had no experience with children, no framework for relating to a 10-year-old boy who had lost his mother and sister and who had every reason to be suspicious of strangers entering his life. But Ethan surprised her. He was quiet but observant, asking careful questions about her job, about the building where his father worked now, about whether she had ever met any astronauts. She answered honestly, admitting she had not met any astronauts but promising to introduce him if she ever did. He nodded solemnly, as if this was a reasonable gap in her experience that could be addressed with time. After lunch, as they walked through a nearby park, Ethan fell into step beside Claire, leaving his father a few paces ahead. "My dad says you are the reason he gets to be an engineer again," he said, his voice matter-of-fact, carrying no accusation or gratitude, simply stating what he understood to be true. Claire glanced at Marcus, who was pretending to study a squirrel in a nearby tree. "Your dad is very talented," she replied. "He would have found a way back eventually." "Maybe," Ethan said, "but you made it sooner. That matters." He looked up at her with an expression that seemed older than his years. "Thank you for seeing him." Claire did not know how to respond. She was not accustomed to gratitude this direct, this unencumbered by professional courtesy or transactional calculation. She simply nodded, and they continued walking, the three of them moving through the spring afternoon like something that might, with time, become familiar. 6 months later, Claire announced a new initiative at Axis Technologies. The company would revise its hiring algorithms to eliminate automatic rejections based on employment gaps alone. Every candidate who met the technical qualifications would receive human review, regardless of their work history. The change would slow down the hiring process. It would require additional recruiters, additional hours, additional costs that the finance team would question. But it would ensure that people like Marcus, people whose resumes told only part of their story, would not be dismissed before they had a chance to be seen. The announcement made industry news. Some praised it as progressive, a model for more humane hiring practices. Others criticized it as inefficient, a sacrifice of scalability on the altar of sentiment that would ultimately harm the company's competitiveness. Claire did not care about the criticism. She had seen what the old system missed. She was not willing to miss it again. Marcus was promoted that same quarter. Not to management, which he declined, preferring to stay close to the technical work he loved, but to a senior technical role that allowed him to mentor younger engineers while maintaining the flexible schedule he needed. He continued to pick Ethan up from school when his shift allowed, continued to help with homework, continued to be present for the moments that mattered. The balance he had fought so hard to build remained intact, supported now by a company that understood its value. A year after the morning in Starbucks, Marcus and Claire stood in the same coffee shop, waiting in the same line. This time, there was no declined card. This time, she paid for both their drinks without comment, a small gesture that carried no weight beyond the simple fact of it. They sat at a table by the window, watching the Monday morning crowds rush past, each person carrying their own story, their own struggles, their own invisible gaps that no algorithm could measure. "It was never about the coffee," Marcus said quietly. Claire smiled, the expression reaching her eyes in a way it rarely did in board meetings or investor presentations. "No," she agreed. "It was never about the coffee. It was about seeing someone, really seeing them, and choosing to act." He nodded, lifting his cup. 2 second chances. She raised her own cup, meeting his halfway across the table, to the people brave enough to take them. Outside, the city continued its relentless motion. Inside, 2 people who had found each other through circumstance and choice sat together. No longer strangers, no longer merely colleagues. Something new was forming between them, something built on mutual respect and shared understanding of loss, something that might, with time and care, become a family again. Ethan was waiting at home, probably working on his math homework, probably wondering what his father and Claire were talking about. He had started calling her by her first name, had started saving articles about space exploration to share with her at Sunday dinners, had started asking if she would help him with his science project about the solar system. The questions were careful, tentative, the probing of a child who had learned too young that the people you love can disappear without warning. But he was also hopeful in ways he had not been for years. Marcus could see it in the way his son smiled now, more freely than he had since before the accident. The nightmares were rare, months between them rather than nights. The flinching at sudden sounds had faded until it was barely noticeable. The boy who had been so afraid of losing his father was beginning to trust that some things could last, that some people could stay. Marcus thought about Sarah sometimes, about what she would think of all this. He liked to believe she would approve. She had always said that kindness was the only thing that really mattered, that everything else was just details and complications. A security guard paying for a stranger's coffee, a CEO looking past an algorithm, a family rebuilt from the pieces of what was lost. Small acts, compounding over time. That was how the world changed. Not through grand gestures or dramatic transformations, but through the quiet choices people made when no one was watching. The choice to help, the choice to see, the choice to try again, even when every reasonable measure suggested it was not worth the risk. Marcus finished his coffee and stood. Claire rose with him, and they walked out into the Manhattan morning together, their shoulders almost touching, their futures uncertain but somehow less frightening than they had been a year ago. Behind them, the barista was already calling the next order, the line moving forward, the day continuing as days always did. But something had shifted, something small and significant and impossible to measure. 2 people had found each other across a gap that should have kept them apart, and in doing so, had proven that the gaps were never as permanent as they seemed. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.